There are few alternate history scenarios with as many videos made on it as what if the Roman Empire never fell. It was one of the grandest civilizations of the ancient world and lasted for thousands of years, so one can't help but to wonder what would have happened if it never fell. Despite how much this topic has been covered, I still want to offer my take on it, with my own video style and flavor. So, let's get to it. This will be the first episode in an alternate history series on what if the Roman Empire as a whole never fell. If not just the East survived, but the entire empire. I will acknowledge that this video series will, to a certain extent, not just be alternate history, but also a work of fiction. I will be filling in details that obviously won't be entirely predictable, and attempt to write an interesting alternate history for this world. I hope you enjoy the scenario. The Roman Empire got its start as a small city-state on the Italian peninsula around 753 BC. But throughout the centuries, it conquered the rest of the peninsula and eventually the entire Mediterranean after surpassing and defeating its rivals. But Rome as a continental power really started to take shape after Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul around 50 BC and his following appointment as the first Roman emperor. Caesar was assassinated not long after, but this was what put Rome down a path towards domination of the continent. Following his death, Augustus took over as emperor, and from then on Rome would be an empire led by an emperor rather than a republic. The conquest of Gaul had pushed the Roman border all the way to the Rhine, and by this point it was clear that by far the biggest threat to the empire for years to come would be the Germanic tribes now right on the Roman border. Thus, in the years following the birth of Christ, Rome began a series of campaigns in Germania in an attempt to pacify it. This concluded in the late 10s AD, where Germanicus would lead a campaign which would see the Roman conquest of Germania. Keeping Germania under Rome would turn out to be a costly endeavor, as the founding of new cities as well as construction of roads and infrastructure would be necessary, but it would help solidify Rome's control over the continent and security of its borders tremendously. By 50 AD, Rome would also conquer Britannia and solidify its northern border along the Danube, and by 150 AD, Dacia, as well as the rest of the Pannonian Basin, would be under Roman control. This would for centuries be approximately what Rome kept under control, occasionally gaining and losing territory. It would also in 313 AD convert to Christianity and gradually spread the religion to Europe, but by 541 AD is when we see Rome begin to struggle as a major plague outbreak shakes the empire for a century. This combined with the long Roman Sassanid War in the 600s would lead to Rome weakening significantly as especially the eastern half of the empire suffers. The Sassanids would be in a similar situation, and the Muslim Arabs who had established a caliphate in Arabia would take advantage of that, conquering the Sassanids. The Romans would bring legions from the west though, and stand firm in the Levant and Egypt, leading to it only losing minor border territories to the caliphate. But this long period of continuous plague outbreaks, as well as destructive wars and military focus on the east, also had the consequence of Rome losing its grip on its border territories in the west. The governor of Britannia would, with the support of several minor Celtic Britannian rulers, secede from the Roman Empire and found the independent Kingdom of Britannia. Mauritania, Egypt, and Assyria would attempt the same, as especially Egypt was dissatisfied with the cost of the war with the Sassanids and the Caliphate. This was partially because much of their food was exported to the Roman legions on the front line, and this, along with a drought in the region, resulted in many dying from starvation. Rome, already dealing with uprisings in Germania and Pannonia, would not have the resources to spare for a reconquest of Britannia, and from then on Britannia would remain separate from Rome once again. Egypt, Assyria, and Mauritania would agree to getting some independence, but remaining tributes of Rome, and supplying the empire with food, as well as allowing Roman troops access to their territory. This long period of instability and conflict almost tore Rome apart, but several skilled and intelligent emperors managed to hold most of the empire together through strong military leadership and governmental reform. Rome would over the next few centuries become increasingly feudal in its structure, allowing governing, especially further from the capital, to be much more efficient. During this period, Rome would also establish close trading ties with the Danes and other Germanic Norse people in Scandinavia, north of the province of Germania. This close relationship would turn out to be great for Rome in the late 700s and onwards, as these Norse people, also known as the Vikings, would begin a period of raiding and conquest across much of Europe. During this time, Rome's close relationship with many local earls in the region of Dacia would significantly limit Viking raids on Roman territory, and these raiders would focus mainly on Britannia and the many other petty kingdoms in the Britannian Isles, The Norse people would also sail far to the north and west, and discover new lands which they settle and name Iceland and Greenland. They would also discover a vast new continent, which they would name Vinland. This Viking era would come to an end, however, as the local Celtic people in Britannia would push out the Norse invaders, and the Romans would gain more and more influence in Dania. Scandinavia would slowly become Christianized, and the newly united Dania would become a Roman tribute. The Vikings did certainly leave their mark on the world though, as it was through them that the Romans would learn about the vast, almost untouched continent across the Atlantic. Rome did not have much of an interest in this land at first, but after several long wars with the Muslim Caliphate in the Middle East, Rome lost its tributary state of Egypt to the Caliphate. This blocked much of the Roman trade with the East, leading to the Romans attempting to make their way around Africa and sail west to Asia through the newly discovered vast continent, eventually named Cornelia after Roman explorer Cornelius. Rome would establish trading outposts along the coast of Cornelia and Africa, eventually making their way to the Indian Ocean, as well as discovering the Maya and Muisca civilizations in Cornelia in the 1200s. Rome would colonize the less developed lands of the Caribbean, as well as the lands to the west of the Maya. Here Rome would discover Lake Texcoco, an ideal spot for a city and trading center where the Romans would found the city of Augustopolis, named after the emperor at the time, Augustus II. This sudden Roman interest in the vast continent to the west would also lead to the Scandinavians maintaining their Greenland settlements with regular shipments despite the harsh conditions. Back home in Eurasia, the Mongol Empire had been expanding at an incredible rate and conquered much of the continent. The Mongols would also in the mid-1200s conquer most of the Muslim Caliphate and attempt to push into Rome through Anatolia, as well as the province of Chersonesos. Here the Romans would manage to defeat the Mongols, and the massive empire would spread no further west. The Mongols brought many things with them from Asia, one of which would also end up being the downfall of their successor states. As the Mongols crumbled into smaller and smaller khanates, the Roman and Slavic states to the north would acquire gunpowder. This would help them significantly in their conquest of the various hordes in the 1300s. Eventually, Rome would liberate Egypt and regain their tributary state there. They would also push out the Golden Horde from Ruthenia and the lands north of the Caucasus. At the same time, the Duchy of Moscow, as well as Lithuania, would grow significantly in power as they conquer many of their smaller neighbors and chip away at the bordering hordes. Lithuania would gain control of much of the Baltic region, and Moscow would become the most prominent Slavic power in the sparsely populated lands of the Rus. Rome would see the growth of this Lithuanian power right on their border as a threat, leading to Rome conquering it by the early 1400s. But less than a century later, in the late 1400s, the Duchy of Moscow would have gradually expanded and united most of the Rus people. Once again, Rome would have a foe right on their doorstep, and over a long period of time, Rome would have several wars with the Russians. Russia would go between being a tribute, being almost conquered, and being fully independent multiple times throughout the coming centuries. But in the meantime, Rome would also focus on its colonization of Cornelia and expansion of the Indian Ocean trade. In Cornelia, the city of Augustopolis would have grown to become the center of the colony of Atlantia, named after the old Greek myth of a land to the west of Gibraltar. The trading outpost in northern Cornelia would also have grown to encompass much of the eastern coast, and forming the United Colonies of North Cornelia, or just the United Colonies. South Cornelia would be in a similar situation. The Romans managed to subjugate the Muisca and make a tributary state of the Incan Empire shortly after their rise in the early 1500s. They would also settle the eastern coast of South Cornelia, naming the colony there Urugia, after the local Guarani word for the river in the region. These Cornelian colonies brought great wealth back to Rome, and also inspired the Britannians and Scandinavians to attempt the same. The Scandinavians, who had been united by the Roman tributary state of Dania, had maintained their Greenland settlements and would now settle further west, establishing their colony of Vinland in the lands which Leif Erikson had discovered centuries ago. Britannia would also attempt to establish their own colonies in Cornelia, founding the small trading outpost of New London on an island ideal for settlement, which the natives called Manhattan. This trading outpost would grow to become a prominent town in the region, and the center of the Britannian colony of Avalon, named after the island in Arthurian legend. Both Britannia and Scandinavia would attempt to get a share of the valuable Indian Ocean trade, establishing trading outposts of their own on the African coast as well as in India and the East Indies. Scandinavia would not see as much success, as they were unable to compete with Britannia, which had grown to become quite a formidable naval power, and even managed to purchase a few Roman outposts following a costly war between Rome and the Russians. This colonial competition would go on for some time, with Rome remaining in control of most of Cornelia, as well as Scandinavia settling for minor trading outposts, growing their Vinland colony, and establishing their largest eastern colony in the East Indies. Meanwhile, Britannia saw great success in the Indian Ocean and Africa. They would establish what would become quite a large colony in the south of Africa, and also take control of the Bengal region in India. They would also discover a great continent to the south, naming it Australia, after the hypothesized Terra Australis in the southern hemisphere, which would become a Britannian penal colony later on. But before that, in 1641, a major conflict would arise. It all started in the United Colonies in northern Cornelia, where the peasants had become increasingly discontent with their rulers and the elite. Most Roman citizens in Cornelia lived in subpar conditions compared to their European counterparts. This was because many resources would be sent over to the homeland, and Cornelians would also see higher taxes. Meanwhile, the bureaucratic elite would see great wealth and live in luxury. As a Roman colony, they also lacked any representation in the Senate over in Europe. This would all lead to revolts across the colonies and eventually revolution. The peasants and many local legions who sided with the revolutionaries rose up and took control of the North Cornelian colonies. They established their own Senate, wrote a constitution, and declared complete independence from the Roman Empire. This happened during a major war between Rome and a Russo-Persian alliance. It would end up shaking the Western world, as well as embolden more Roman subjects to attempt the same. The Atlantean elite, worried that they would meet a similar fate to those in the United Colonies, decided to declare their own independence and align themselves with the United Provinces against Rome. They would also cater to the population with the establishment of their own Senate and some democratic institutions. Loyalists in North Cornelia would flock to the far north and would maintain control there along the border with Avalon. From here, they would attempt to push south and regain control of major cities and the coastline. For months, the two sides fought, with Rome eventually controlling many major Cornelian cities, but the Cornelians had been plotting and managed to establish diplomatic relations with Britannia and Scandinavia. Britannia was interested in weakening Rome and perhaps gaining more colonies. Meanwhile, the Scandinavians had grown a strong national identity and wanted their independence. So, Britannia and Scandinavia declared war on the Roman Empire, which was already fighting in Cornelia, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East. The Britannians and Scandinavians would push south from Vinland and Avalon, and along with the United Provinces, crush the Roman loyalists in North Cornelia. One of the reasons for this decisive victory was that the Roman Emperor realized that it would be a losing battle if Rome were to attempt maintaining so many fronts at once, and the combined Scandinavia-Britannian fleet would also outnumber the Romans after their loss of much of their fleet in Cornelia to the revolutionaries. So, instead Rome focused on their homeland, pushing the Scandinavians to the Daunian Straits, and eventually defeating the already struggling Russians and keeping the Persians out of Anatolia. Rome would sign a peace treaty, and their revolting subjects would be granted their independence. Britannia would also be given more Roman overseas holdings, but Rome would still keep most of their South Cornelian colonies and also finally completely annex Russia, reaffirming Rome's dominance over their home continent. Roman relations with Britannia and Scandinavia would remain tenuous following the war, but with time those wounds would heal. Following the war, Britannia was hurting economically, and it sold its colony of Avalon to the United Provinces to help pay its immense debt. The revolution in Cornelia would also inspire a similar revolution in economically struggling post-war Britannia. This would result in the nation reforming and becoming a republic much like its ally across the pond. Scandinavia and Rome would also move in a more democratic direction to avoid a similar fate, with Rome giving the mostly ceremonial Senate much of their powers back, as well as putting in place checks and balances for emperors, making the emperor less of a king. Further down the line, the emperor would also become more of a symbolic figurehead, and the country would really be run by the Senate and elected consuls. Along with this wave of revolutions and democracy, also came a new age of enlightenment. New political philosophies arose, and the Western world would now focus much less on the spiritual and more on reason and science. This movement was especially prominent in Cornelia, where it was birthed, as well as in Britannia. This is part of what eventually led to the Industrial Revolution, starting in Britannia in the mid to late 1700s, where a wave of new technology allowed for more efficient production of goods through the use of machines. This gave Rome's neighbors of Scandinavia, and especially Britannia, a significant leg up when it came to technology. It allowed Britannia to push around their much larger Roman neighbor for decades to come, taking many of their colonies after several humiliating defeats for Rome. Britannia would now rule the seas, and Rome would lose their power outside of their home continent, eventually even losing their grip on the Incan tributary state, as well as their South Cornelian colonies. Meanwhile, the United Provinces in North Cornelia would grow significantly in power, slowly pushing their influence westwards, as ambitious migrants from all over Rome, Britannia, and Scandinavia would flock to the young republic. The United Provinces would become a bastion of personal freedom and democracy. It would also stand in opposition to colonialism and supported the South Cornelian independence movements when Rome was losing its grip on the continent. By the mid to late 1800s, the balance of powers in the world would see a significant shift, as the United Provinces' power and wealth grew to rival even that of the Romans, and Japan industrialized after being forced to open its economy to the outside world. This led to a major war in the opening years of the 1900s, as Japan had slowly been growing its colonial empire, and now attempted to take Britannian and Scandinavian holdings in Asia. The war was hard fought and costly for the European powers of Britannia and Scandinavia, who would lose in the end, as they were less capable of projecting power so far away. And so Japan would grow to become the major player in East Asia, as China remained isolated and unable to oppose the Japanese due to the technological gap, not too dissimilar to the relationship between Rome and Britannia in the not-so-distant past. Following the war, the Britannian colony of India would push for independence, as they felt oppressed by their Britannian rulers and forced participation in foreign wars. This would mark the beginning of a period of decolonization for the Europeans. Britannia and Scandinavia would slowly, throughout the first half of the 1900s, allow more and more of their colonies to govern themselves. This happened as support for maintaining these colonies and suppressing uprisings was lost, thanks in part to cultural influence from the United Provinces, but also simply the cost of having to defend them. The age of European colonialism would end, and a new era would begin as China, a continental power much like Rome, would begin to industrialize and grow economically. Rome would also have caught up to their Britannian neighbors at this point. This would all create an extremely multipolar world, with several continental powers, as well as a lot of secondary powers with their own significant spheres of influence. While this was happening, Japan would go in an increasingly democratic direction and allow their subjects more self-rule, eventually evolving their empire into more of a Japanese-centered anti-Chinese alliance. And this is just about the situation the world would be until this day. The biggest players in this world would be Rome, the United Provinces, and China, with Japan and Britannia being secondary powers, and with nations such as India and Uruguay on the rise as major regional powers. But that's just about all for now. Stay tuned for the next episode, where I'll focus more on the world today. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you want to see more content like this in the future. Also, please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. See you around.